Hi, welcome to the channel, Witness for Jesus. This is Dawn. This video will address the assertions of Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, otherwise known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, in regard to blood. There are two previous videos in this series which address what the Bible says about blood. If you haven't seen them, I strongly recommend that you do. Part 2 in particular addresses the Christian view of blood and things that Jesus said which have a direct bearing on how we use blood. Please watch that for the biblical view. Jehovah's Witnesses claim that their decision to refuse blood transfusions is based upon scripture, but we see that over and over again they use other arguments against blood transfusions, suggesting that blood transfusions are dangerous. Since they refuse blood based upon the Bible, these arguments shouldn't really come into the picture. However, in order to cover this aspect, I want to look at a number of things in regard to blood use. First, are blood transfusions dangerous? And if so, how dangerous are they? Are there circumstances where refusing blood is a good idea? Are there circumstances where a blood transfusion is medically necessary? Has the Organisation of Jehovah's Witnesses told the truth about blood safety, and have they been scientifically accurate in their literature? Do Jehovah's Witnesses actually abstain from blood? And are Jehovah's Witnesses free to choose without consequences? Would I personally accept a blood transfusion? My answer may surprise you. Your decision about blood, if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, should be based on the Bible according to the religion itself. However, all of us, when considering a medical procedure, should make an informed decision based upon scientific information. So let's take a quick look at what the Jehovah's Witness organisation says in the frequently asked questions about blood on their website. It says here, myth. Many witnesses, including children, die each year as a result of refusing blood transfusions. Fact. This statement is totally unfounded. Surgeons regularly perform such complex procedures as heart operations, orthopaedic surgery and organ transplants without the use of blood transfusions. Patients, including children who do not receive transfusions, usually fare well as or better than those who do accept transfusions. In any case, no one can say for certain that a patient will die because of refusing blood or will live because of accepting it. Okay, so is it accurate? Let's ask ourselves now, is it accurate to say that it is totally unfounded that people die from refusing blood? Well, no, it's not unfounded. Even the Jehovah's Witness organisation has admitted that there have been many, many deaths from refusing blood. In their Awake article dated 22nd of May 1994, we see the cover of the magazine filled with pictures of Jehovah's Witness children who died refusing blood. Does this picture support what is said today on the jw.org frequently asked questions section? Remember, it says that the assertion that people, including children, die from refusing blood is totally unfounded. Yet here we see that children have died from refusing blood, and this article praises them, giving a clear message to others that refusing blood is necessary, even if it means that you will die. I'm going to play a clip now, courtesy of JW Victims YouTube channel, which shows a convention talk where a governing body member tells us about a Jehovah's Witness boy who refused blood.
They brought him to the regional hospital to get the best medical treatment possible, but without blood. And one of the parents said we'd have left him at home if we wanted him to die. So there are people that think that way, but it's not us. We don't want Josh to die. We're doing everything medically to keep him alive. And that's what anyone would do for any of their loved ones. We're not here to watch him die. We're here to get that boy better, so he can walk out and go back and do the things he loves, including the Kingdom Hall and meetings and field service. Well, one night, this is when it's very hard, but here's what happened. When Josh was in the hospital, he said, "Mom, a lot of times when you go to the bathroom or go to get Dad, and doctors come in, and here's what they say, Josh, you need a blood transfusion. Without it, you will die. We want to help you." You know what Josh responded? All alone. Then please respect my wishes about blood. He says, "I told one doctor who tried to get me to take blood, you may think I'm crazy, but I have all my thinking abilities. I just want to live by Jehovah's law on blood. He knows what is best for us. The best thing for me is to respect the sanctity of life, and if I die, I will live again." Good example of faith in the face of incredible stress and persecution. Amazing young fella. And when he's resurrected, see, you'll hear more from him because Jehovah loves that little fella.
Now that boy died, and of course he's been praised for his decision. Is it totally honest of JW.org then to say that it is totally unfounded to say that people, including children, lose their lives? This frequently asked questions section is very misleading. It would have been entirely possible for the writers to be honest, to say yes, people die from refusing blood, but we believe that it's necessary in order to obey God. But instead, they try and tell us that people are not dying. I've had this conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses where they tell me that very, very few people die from refusing blood transfusions. And this is because they keep reading that in Watchtower literature. However, let's look now at the actual number of deaths. There have been independent studies conducted, but overall we can only know the numbers of deaths based upon proven scientific figures relating to how many people require life-saving blood transfusions out of the general population. Of course, there are situations where blood substitutes can be used. Are there situations where whole blood transfusion is needed and nothing else will help? Watchtower promote non-blood alternatives, and these can be used where the person has prior warning. For example, if they're having elective surgery and they're choosing in advance what products may be used. Yet there are other situations where the patient cannot plan in advance and where whole blood is necessary to prevent death. These situations include hemorrhage during childbirth and postpartum hemorrhage. In this case, while blood expanders and other products can be used, they will not be adequate if the blood loss is too great. In those circumstances, full blood is required, and if full blood transfusion is not given, then the mother dies. Now, I will speak a little bit later about the postpartum hemorrhage rates to give us more information on that. Another circumstance is when blood loss is from injury, and only full blood will help in that situation given particular circumstances. Another is if blood transfusion is required as a result of chemotherapy complications, for the reason that red blood cells and other cells in blood are important. And also any other circumstance where major blood loss occurs and planning isn't possible, full blood is used. So looking at these circumstances, the website ajwrb.org, which stands for Associated Jehovah's Witness Reform on Blood.org, has an article which outlines a study done by a medical doctor on how many people die from refusing blood. I'll provide you a link to this article in the video description, but I'm going to summarise, just read out the main points in that article because it is very good. In 2001, Dr. Muramoto used a study by Kitchens, Are Transfusions Overrated? Surgical Outcome of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was published in the February 1993 issue of the American Journal of Medicine on pages 117 to 119. The study was based on 1,404 bloodless surgeries performed on Jehovah's Witnesses and showed that 1.4% of these patients died to a lack of blood as either a primary or contributing cause of their death. Simply stated, this means that every time a Jehovah's Witness had bloodless surgery, their chance of death was 1.4% greater due to refusing blood. In an abundance of caution, Dr. Muramoto elected to round down this figure to 1% to allow for some who may have died anyway. So, stated another way, he determined that for every 100 bloodless operations on Jehovah's Witnesses, one death could be attributed to blood refusal. At that time, the American Association of Blood Banks reported that approximately 4 million patients received blood transfusions from 12.6 million units of donated blood every year, and that meant that 4 million, or 15 out of every 1,000 Americans, had conditions requiring blood each year. There were about 1 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States at that time, so approximately 15,000 Jehovah's Witnesses would have had conditions that would normally require a blood transfusion. If their rate of death increased by 1% due to blood refusal, that means at about 150 Jehovah's Witnesses died that year in the United States alone due to observing the Watchtower's blood prohibition. That's the United States alone. Note. Since Jehovah's Witnesses are a multinational religious organisation, we have to extend this extrapolation to account for these numbers in other countries. And we also have to account for the fact that the policy has been in place since 1945. However, since observing the policy was optional until 1961, we have elected to leave out the years from 1945 to 1961. Like Dr. Muramoto, we want to err on the side of caution, even though it can be reasonably assumed that many deaths occurred during this period due to very limited availability of bloodless treatment. We've compiled Watchtower's published data on Jehovah's Witness publishers' numbers between the years of 1961 and 2016. Over this 56-year period, the average number of publishers per year was 3,957,868. Converting the factor determined by Dr. Muramoto, this would indicate that 33,246 Jehovah's Witnesses died during this 56-year period. On an annual basis, that works out to average of 594 deaths per year, with 1,220 deaths in 2016. It's our conclusion this represents a conservative estimate, since many of the high-tech treatments and medical equipment currently in use did not exist in earlier years, and to this day does not exist in third world countries where Jehovah's Witnesses have experienced much of their growth. While actual numbers will never be known, it is probable that the actual numbers of death amongst Jehovah's Witnesses population is higher, perhaps significantly higher. So that's the end of the summary in that article. So this outlines that over 33,000 Jehovah's Witnesses have died over a 56-year period, and that this is a very conservative estimate. The actual figures could be higher, considering that as the number of JWs increases, the number of deaths naturally will. In 2016, the number was up to 1,200 per annum worldwide, and this is a normal annual figure then. Over a 10-year period, we're looking at 12,000 witnesses dying over the last 10 years, for instance. At the same page on this website, it outlines other studies which have been conducted scientifically. I'm going to link you to those because, of course, you need to research this too. One of these studies indicates a higher death toll as well of 46,000 deaths over the 50-year period. Now, please check this. If you're one of the people who says that people are not dying from refusing blood, you really, really, really need to educate yourself. My own research into postpartum hemorrhage has led me to conclude that about 60% of blood-related deaths are Jehovah's Witness mothers in childbirth. Now, why am I making that assertion? Well, I looked at the numbers of women who need a blood transfusion due to blood loss during childbirth and how many of all births require a transfusion. Now, 1% of all women giving birth will experience postpartum hemorrhage. Not all of these require a blood transfusion, however, and 8% will die actually, even if they do have a blood transfusion. Now, 60% of Jehovah's Witnesses are women, but not all of those women are of childbearing age or have children. So let's be very conservative with estimates and say that 10% of all Jehovah's Witnesses women may have a child in any given year. Given 8,300,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, that means 83,000 Jehovah's Witness women giving birth. 1% of those will have a postpartum hemorrhage. That is 830 women. Of those, even if half of them survive the hemorrhage, that still leaves 415 deaths in 1 year. This makes sense considering that we've just heard that conservative estimates have 1,200 deaths in 2016 from refusal of blood for all causes. So let's put this argument to bed right now. Jehovah's Witnesses do die from refusing blood. By their own admission, children have died, and we've all heard multiple cases of women dying in childbirth who are Jehovah's Witnesses. We see that there are occasions when blood substitutes are simply not enough, and that's why the medical profession continue to give blood transfusions despite the risks. Putting this in perspective, we were all horrified, absolutely horrified, when over 3,000 people died in the 9/11 attacks. But tens of thousands of people have died as a result of this policy in the Jehovah's Witness religion. People were horrified when the Jonestown cult resulted in the deaths of over 900 people. But the number that die annually who are Jehovah's Witnesses exceeds this. Certainly not all of these deaths make the news. And bear in mind that these are worldwide deaths, which includes countries with less medical expertise, such as third world countries. But all you need to do is Google Jehovah's Witness dies refusing blood, and you'll get thousands of news articles about Jehovah's Witnesses dying. I don't know of any other religious group who are causing the deaths of their members in such numbers. It really, really is shocking. Now, you may be thinking that if those Jehovah's Witnesses have accepted blood, if they had accepted blood, they may have died anyway. After all, many Watchtower articles say that you can die if you accept blood, of complications and of disease that you caught from the transfusion. How accurate is this information? Are blood transfusions dangerous? Well, I'll state clearly that there are dangers, there are certainly dangers to having a blood transfusion. They do come with various problems which can cause death. For example, a person may have an allergic reaction to the blood, which causes breathing difficulties. They may have been given the wrong blood type accidentally, which has been known. It's also been known that people have contracted diseases from blood transfusions. Yet, sadly, in my study of this topic, I realised that Watchtower have vastly overemphasised the dangers of blood transfusions. You only need to speak to one of Jehovah's Witnesses to discover that they are truly afraid of having a blood transfusion, since they strongly believe it's highly dangerous medically. I can't cover everything in this video, so I'll highlight some important information and direct you to places where you can find other information. If you're basing your decision to refuse blood on science, ask yourself why, first of all. The biblical mandate from God is supposed to be your number one reason. Yet, if you're using science, did you read brochures and articles produced by Watchtower and simply accept any information they gave you? It's really important to check sources and to make sure for yourself whether the information you've been given is accurate. Let's look at a couple of examples of information published by Watchtower organisation about the dangers of blood transfusion. In their brochure, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Question of Blood, they quote Dr. C. Ropart's, director of the Central Department of Transfusions in Rouen, in France, as saying that donating blood can be compared to sending a loaded gun to an unsuspecting or unprepared person. Like the loaded gun, there is a safety lever or button governing blood transfusions, but how many persons have died from gunshot wounds as a result of believing the lever was unsafe? Note that this quote is from 1976 and from a French doctor and researcher. If you Google this doctor, you'll discover that he does not disagree with blood transfusions, and in fact he pioneered research into gamma globulins for transfusion. This quote I cannot find online, but you can see how Watchtower chooses emotionally loaded comments from the 1970s, completely out of context, to attempt to suggest that having a blood transfusion is like pointing a loaded gun at yourself. You note also that the doctor in the quote is asking a question, and yet the answer to the question is not quoted. He may have replied to his own question with giving actual statistics of how many people back then in the 70s died from transfusions, but we don't get to see that. Now, if you look at the references list in that brochure, look how much they rely on 1960s and 1970s research to tell you about the dangers of blood. But we know that there have been vast improvements in the safety of blood transfusions, certainly within the last 30 years. It's drastically different, and I'm going to show you a graph in a moment that shows that. An example from more recently, for instance, is that the January 2000 issue of the Watchtower, a doctor is quoted who, in 2010, was exposed as having falsified data to promote his own research. I can link you to documented evidence of this in the video description. Watchtower used the quote of a man who was promoting his own blood expander product and who was later completely discredited. Did they publish later on information to inform you that that doctor was later proved wrong? No. So if you're a Jehovah's Witness doing research on blood, you will come across that 2000 Watchtower article and you'll think it's accurate. When Watchtower knows now that it is not accurate and they have not updated you that this doctor has been completely discredited. The bloodless surgery product that this doctor recommended has now been proven to increase the risk of death. Please see a link to that in the video description. On Watchtower Library and jw.org, you really have to be careful to check the information you're being given. You'll notice, if you're looking carefully, that the statistics given are often very, very old. For example, one article says that 10% of AIDS cases in Africa are caused by infected blood. The article is dated in the 1980s. We know that for a certainty that once AIDS was discovered and medical testing for it started properly, blood began to be routinely screened for HIV. So it's entirely misleading. Moreover, notice how the figures can be skewed by saying 10% of AIDS cases. That's not 10% of blood transfusions resulting in an AIDS infection. No, out of the millions and millions of blood units transfused, only a tiny fraction were infected with AIDS, and that was in the 1980s before proper testing had been implemented. How safe are blood transfusions? Let's look at the actual risk today of getting an infectious disease from a blood transfusion. Here is a graph which shows risks. In the 1980s, you had a 1 in 100 risk of contracting some disease from blood. Bear in mind, however, that most diseases are not fatal. Therefore, even if you contracted something from blood, most of the time you would be able to treat it and live with it. So you can see also on the graph that the risk of getting an infectious disease from a blood transfusion is now 1 in many millions, tens of millions. So the Watchtower articles are not giving those kinds of statistics, but only giving really serious statistics from places like Africa in the 1980s. Let's look at another bit of information. The number of transfusion-related deaths annually reported to the FDA increased steadily from 16 in 1976 to 105 in 2005. Of the latter, however, only 62 were recipient deaths in which the transfusion was the likely or major cause of death. Of 63 deaths reported in 2007, 52 were determined to be due to the blood transfusion. Because approximately 22.3 million units of blood transfusions, platelets, and plasma were transfused in the United States in 2006, the risk of a transfusion-related death can be estimated at approximately 2.3 per million transfused components. So that's even transfusion-related deaths that are not anything to do with disease. We're looking at 2.3 deaths per million transfused components or units of blood. That's a low risk, very low risk. Now, another article was a scientific study which examined 20,000 patients who had excessive bleeding, and this was across 40 different countries. So it says there is a increased mortality from blood transfusions in certain cases. Like I said, transfusions are not completely without risk. So that study discovered that the all-cause mortality appears to vary according to the predictive risk of death. So it says transfusion may reduce mortality or deaths in patients at high risk of death from the blood loss, but may increase mortality in those at low risk. So to summarise all this, blood transfusions are not without risk. They can cause death. However, the actual risk of getting a disease from a blood transfusion today is very low indeed. Also, the actual risk of dying from the blood transfusion for other causes is low also. Personally, I would refuse a blood transfusion unless it was absolutely medically necessary for me. For women in childbirth, they need to accept a transfusion because in the case of postpartum hemorrhage, there are few alternatives. Yes, alternatives can be tried, but in the event that full blood is needed, it should be given. Remember in part 2, we discussed the biblical aspects and how Jesus said that life is more important than law. It's horrendous and tragic to allow young mothers to die for these unscriptural laws. For cases of extreme blood loss in an accident, full blood is needed, and in some other circumstances too, full blood is required. A person may, based on scientific evidence, however, refuse blood in certain circumstances, but accept it in other circumstances. The medical community, though, has now reduced the number of blood transfusions which are given drastically. They simply don't want to waste blood or expose the patient to unnecessary risk. Watchtower would have you think, however, that they'll give you blood even if it's not needed, as though they want to hurt you somehow, but they don't. So when I had surgery recently, I said I would accept a blood transfusion because I'm in full knowledge that they're not going to give me blood if it's not absolutely medically necessary. Moreover, based on my thorough investigation on the scriptures in this matter, which you can listen to in parts 1 and 2, I know that blood transfusion is not forbidden by scripture. Now, all of this assumes that Jehovah's Witnesses actually do abstain from blood. But since around the year 2000, a major change occurred where Jehovah's Witnesses allowed parts of blood or blood fractions to be transfused. On the ajwrb.org website, you can see a full article on this matter, and I'm going to give you a little summary of that. It says, do Jehovah's Witnesses really abstain from blood? Most Jehovah's Witnesses would answer a resounding yes, but even this brief consideration of facts has shown The answer is no. Watchtower policy does not abstain from blood, with the limited exception of whole blood, which is very rarely used anymore. Stop and consider. Can you explain why the Watchtower Society permits the use of blood products like albumin, EPO, hemoglobin, blood serums, immunoglobulins, and haemophiliac treatments, since these are clearly taken to sustain life? How can this honestly be considered as abstaining from blood? The obvious answer is it cannot. If the medical use of blood products is wrong, we cannot pick and choose which blood fractions or products we will abstain from, any more than we can engage in a little fornication or a little idol worship. Such reasoning is seriously flawed, and the Watchtower has been slowly dismantling this policy for decades because they know it is wrong. Are only the smallest blood components permitted? Sometimes it's argued that the blood components allowed by Watchtower Society are tiny fractions of blood. This line of argument seems impossible to sustain, since albumin, which is found in blood plasma and approved for use by the Watchtower Society, makes up a greater percentage of the blood volume, 2.2%, than forbidden blood components like white blood cells, which are 1%, and platelets, which are 0.17%. Which witnesses must reject. Furthermore, hemoglobin is a huge blood product, weighing in at 14.8% of blood volume. Additionally, haemophiliac treatments, which have long been permitted, require the collection and storage of massive quantities of blood, up to 2,500 blood donors for one single treatment. Yet the Watchtower Society forbids witnesses from storing their own blood. Why does such a double standard exist? So we can see that Watchtower organisation seem really confused in their position on what blood fractions, so-called fractions, are allowed. They're allowing these so-called fractions, for instance, albumin, which is 2.2% of the blood, but they're not allowing other fractions like white blood cells, which are 1% of the blood. It's unbelievable, really, and it doesn't make any sense. And hemoglobin, it's unfathomable, really. They're allowing hemoglobin, but hemoglobin is 14.8% of blood volume. Really, you must ask yourself, what does this have to do with the Bible? What does this have to do with the mandate in the scriptures in regard to blood? What does it have to do with it? How did they know that suddenly God was okay with you accepting parts of blood? Now, this is such a hypocritical stance. Jehovah's Witnesses are not abstaining from blood in this sense. Now, of course, individual Jehovah's Witnesses may choose to avoid all blood products. They may not choose to have the blood fractions. However, Jehovah's Witnesses who I have spoken to, and I know from personal experience, would accept blood fractions if it was required, because basically they don't really want to be put in the position of facing their own death, really. And if it's permitted by Watchtower Society, then they're likely to take it. Jehovah's Witnesses say that all of this is a personal choice. So we've seen so far that the Watchtower Society in its literature is drastically exaggerating its position in regard to the dangers of blood. The actual dangers of a blood transfusion are very, very small nowadays, and blood is rarely given unless it's absolutely necessary nowadays. We're in 2020 now. We're not in the 1980s or 70s. We're not there anymore. You know, it's had its problems in the past, but it's still a life-saving treatment. There are still millions and millions and millions of people around the world who are alive because they have accepted a blood transfusion. So demonizing blood medically is something that really is not accurate factually and scientifically. And all I will say in regard to that for Jehovah's Witnesses, or for anyone else who used to be a Jehovah's Witness who still thinks that blood is dangerous, please, please, please do your own research. Look at the actual risks. Like I said, I wouldn't have blood if I didn't need it. I don't want to bring that risk upon myself. But I know for a certainty that if I did need it, I would take the risk, because the risk of me dying of the blood transfusion is very small. The risk of me dying if I refuse blood altogether in that circumstance, well, I would die. If I had massive blood loss, I would die. So this is why each person has to really examine the evidence, examine it. Don't just believe what you're told in a magazine by Watchtower, please. Do your research, look at when their references are from and who they're referencing, and please just look it up yourself. So let's talk about this personal choice thing. It's a personal choice. Oh, no one's forcing you to refuse blood. Oh, no, it's a personal choice. It's nothing to do with the religion. They can't be blamed. It's people's individual choice. Well, frankly, that's rubbish. I just don't accept it at all. No Christian outside of the Jehovah's Witness organisation ever comes to this conclusion when they're reading the Bible for themselves. Christians do not sit reading the Bible and think, oh, I'd better not have a blood transfusion. Parts 1 and 2, I detail clearly what the Bible is saying in regard to blood and in regard to life, and whether life is more important than law, and what Jesus said about those things. And if you've not listened, please listen to those 2 parts, because it's very important. So no Christian is going to come to this conclusion on their own. The only people who are refusing blood transfusions on religious grounds, as far as I'm aware anyway, there may be other fringe groups, but as far as I'm aware, are Jehovah's Witnesses. So first off, it's not an entirely personal decision. They're basing their decision on what they have been taught by Watchtower Society. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, I refused blood. I had a medical procedure which carried a significant risk of hemorrhage. It was a gynecological procedure, and I told the doctor that I was refusing blood prior to the operation. Now, what did I base my decision upon? I based my decision entirely upon what I'd been told by the Watchtower publications and at the Watchtower meetings. Did I check the scientific information that had been given? No, I didn't, because I believed them blindly. I didn't check anything for myself, I simply believed them. I also accepted all their so-called scriptural arguments. So yeah, I put my life at risk because I didn't check, and because the Jehovah's Witness organisation as a whole had taught me this position and this stance, and also taught me that it was an admirable thing to do, that it was I would be given favour by God by refusing blood and actually dying, and that I would wake up in paradise. All of these teachings are what influence the individual. This is not something where you can say it's purely an individual's choice doing their own research. They certainly haven't. And they don't want to do their own research. I've spoken to many Jehovah's Witnesses I'm trying to explain these things to, and they don't want to know. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you've got to this point in the video, I want to commend you. I want to say, wow, thank you for continuing to listen and being honest with yourself. But I know that many Jehovah's Witnesses won't reach this position in the video if they've even clicked on it at all, because they don't want to know information that contradicts the organisation. It's sometimes too painful for them. Now, what is the result if you do accept a blood transfusion in the Jehovah's Witness organisation? Well, it used to be that you were straight out disfellowshipped. So it was a major consequence in the sense that accepting blood was seen as a disfellowshipping offence. Now, due to the law in many countries about human rights, The Watchtower organisation were put under massive pressure to remove that requirement. But what happens now? So here we are in 2020. If you have a blood transfusion, what's going to happen? Okay, well, if you are willful accepting the blood transfusion and you're not repentant, then there's a statement that Watchtower released in June the 14th, year 2000. I'm going to read this to you. This is a statement of the Watchtower organisation to the media. It says, if a baptised member of the faith willfully and without regret accepts blood transfusions, he indicates by his own actions that he no longer wishes to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The individual revokes his own membership by his own actions, rather than the congregation initiating this step. This represents a procedural change instituted in April 2000, in which the congregation no longer initiates the action to revoke membership in such cases. However, the end result is the same. The individual is no longer viewed as one of Jehovah's Witnesses because he no longer accepts and follows the core tenet of the faith. However, if such an individual later changes his mind, he may be accepted back as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. This position has not changed. So nowadays, if you accept blood and you are not repentant, you're willful, then you are effectively disassociating yourself. And in disassociating yourself, as we all know, you are treated exactly like a disfellowshipped person. An announcement is made exactly the same from this platform that such a person is now no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. This does not inform the congregation as to the reason. For all the congregation knows, you're a willful sinner, adulterer, whatever. But in fact, you may have just decided to accept blood. Some of the components of blood that are not on their allowed list. Okay. So if you decide that you're willing to accept blood because you don't think it makes sense to accept blood fractions only, then you are disassociated from Jehovah's Witnesses. Your friends in Jehovah's Witnesses will shun you. Your family will shun you to the level that they're told to do so. Some take that further than other family members, but basically there is serious consequences to taking blood in the Jehovah's Witness organisation. It's simply not just simply a personal decision where you've got all the freedom in the world to take blood. But if you're in that position as a Jehovah's Witness, I just want to also say that if you do accept blood and save your life, all you need to say is that you're sorry and be repentant for this, and you may avoid being disassociated. So that's one option for people who perhaps want to take blood. Another thing that you must be well aware of is that the medical profession now have procedures in place where they will give a blood transfusion to a Jehovah's Witness and they will not inform your family or other people. So if the hospital liaison committee in Jehovah's Witnesses gets involved, which is of course the elders who promote this false teaching to decline blood, if they're involved, you can still have a blood transfusion because the medical profession will ensure that no one gets told. You can be given a blood transfusion at night, for instance, when there's no visiting hours, and no one will know. So as a Jehovah's Witness, I think it's very important that you make this decision for yourself and don't think that, you're automatically going to be disassociated if you do accept blood. You have a way out. You have a way out. So I hope that this video, even though it could have been far longer, it could have had much more information in it, but I just hope that this video has helped you to see that the information given by Watchtower organisation is not always accurate. It's out of date, it's fear-mongering in terms of science, and parts 1 and 2 of this video series also discussed at length the biblical aspects of refusing blood transfusions. Please, please, please don't be a victim of this false teaching by this religious group. Please don't be one of the 1,200 approximately people who die per annum for refusing blood as Jehovah's Witnesses. Even former Jehovah's Witnesses may still stick to this idea. It's something that's very difficult to tackle mentally, I think, when you leave the Witnesses. Even for a period of time when I'd left the Witnesses, I still believed that blood was dangerous and that blood was wrong. So we all have to really examine this for ourselves and set our minds free. Look at what the Bible says, look at what the medical science says, and really seriously consider our health and our life, our precious, precious life before God. Thank you for listening. Please share this video series, please. It could save lives. It could save lives of your family and your friends, people who are still involved in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Please share, please subscribe to this channel. Please look at the other videos. There are many videos on this channel which talk about the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. There are interviews, there are testimonies, there are recordings of conversations with Jehovah's Witnesses. So God bless and take care.